Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Laverton. Welcome to Conversing. Today on Conversing, we're going to have the opportunity to welcome two people who are going to help us understand more of a phenomenon happening in the United States and around the world referred to as the New Apostolic Reformation. I'm very glad to welcome Caleb Maskell, who has been on our program before. Caleb has his MDiv from Yale and his PhD from Princeton University in history. He has been a leader, a theological leader in particular, of the Vineyard movement for the past 25 years. He's now the Associate National Director of Theology and Education for the Vineyard and helps lead the Society of Vineyard Scholars. We also have Leah Payne as our guest today. Leah is the Associate Professor of American Religious History at Portland Seminary and Principal Investigator for the Institute for Pastoral and Congregational Thriving at Portland Seminary as well. Leah holds a PhD from Vanderbilt University, and her research explores the intersection of religion, politics, and popular culture. Her most recent book is God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music. Caleb, Leah, we're so thrilled to welcome you today to join us here on Conversing.
Oh, it's so great to be here.
Thank you. It's an honor. I'm excited.
You know, the topic that we're going to be discussing primarily is something that has gotten a lot of popular press coverage, and some of it has been hyper dramatic, some of it has just tried to be descriptive. So I want us to get some terms sorted out. We're going to be talking about something that is known as the New Apostolic Reformation, NAR for short. But before we get to NAR, we have to go back and define a few terms. So let's just start with some basics. This is a movement that is set in the wider Pentecostal movement in the world and in the United States in a particular way. So would one of you just begin with a definition of Pentecostalism?
Sure. I don't mind taking that because I think my colleague can probably manage the charismatic movement much better than I can. But yeah, so I think of Pentecostalism as a form of American revivalism. It's actually a global movement from the outset, but in the United States, it is born out of a series of really kind of dramatic revival meetings. The largest, most influential, most famous one comes from the West Coast, the Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles. It's led by a man named William J. Seymour, who's an African-American man. And there are many hallmarks of the movement. In the earliest days, William J. Seymour viewed this movement as being defined by its interracial qualities. So there are a lot of different kinds of what I might think of as spiritual fireworks that people associate with Pentecostalism today. So practices like the speaking of tongues, which wasn't exclusive to the Pentecostal movement, but becomes a hallmark of it. Divine healing, also not exclusive, but becomes associated with the Pentecostal movement. Things like prophecy, these really mystical experiences with God. But in the earliest days of the movement, the most extraordinary thing, according to William J. Seymour, was the idea that they were desegregated meetings. So Black and white people, Black, white, Latino people, and many other folks that came from all over the world eventually were experiencing this radical move of the Holy Spirit wherein they were praying with one another, weeping with one another. And if you think about the act of divine healing, they were touching one another. So Black, white, Latino people were experiencing the power of God together. This extraordinary moment, most of the movement or most of the denominations that today identify as Pentecostal trace their heritage to that revival meeting. There were lots of other ones that were going on actually all over the world at that time. But the reason why I think of it as primarily based in the Azusa Street Revival is in the United States especially, but all over the world, the two largest Pentecostal denominations, so Church of God in Christ, which was kind of the original Pentecostal denomination. Today it's known as a historically Black denomination. And then the Assemblies of God, which comes out of that movement. And then a plethora of other Pentecostal denominations. It's kind of like Baptists. It's very fractious. So as many different kinds of Baptists as there are that many different kinds of Pentecostals. They trace their heritage to that moment in time. So that's what I think of that's how I tried to explain what Pentecostalism is. It's a little different than other forms of American Christianity, particular Protestant forms of Christianity, because it doesn't have a kind of founding theological figure in the way that Lutherans or Reformed, Calvinists have, but it comes from these revival meetings. So I think of it fundamentally as a practice. To become Pentecostal is not necessarily to sign on to particular theological ideas. It's to have a shared experience. It's to have a shared series of practices. But I don't know, the Dr. Caleb Maskell over there, the Reverend Doctor, I believe. Are you Reverend? I think you are.
I am indeed.
Yeah. Reverend Dr. Caleb Maskell may have a different perspective on that.
Thanks, Leah. That's very helpful. What would you add, Caleb?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very interesting observation that Pentecostalism does not emerge from a founding theological figure, but really a founding set of experiences. And of course, almost immediately from the emerging of Pentecostal spirituality, what those experiences are and how they should be experienced are contested, right? Because it is fractious, like Leah said. But I think the thing I'd want to press on for the purposes of our conversation today is that in the absence of a founding theological figure, or really a founding sort of theology in the traditional sense, there's also some pretty significant limits to the ecclesiology and the understanding of what makes a church, right? I don't think those things were necessarily intentional or especially thought through. But important questions would be things like, well, in what way are Pentecostal churches connected to, say, the history of Christianity or the historic church for the prior 1900 years before Pentecostalism's establishment? And also, how does authority work in that context? Because, of course, the establishment of a historic denomination or prior to that often involved things like, well, here are the bishops, or here is the presbytery, or here are the various ways that our congregations make decisions. Here are the things that we believe. Here are our confessions, etc. So I think paying attention to not the absence of that, because it's very easy to make this sound like all experience and no sort of formal or methodological content. That's not true. But I just think those things are contested in ways that they're not among, say, different versions of Presbyterianism, or even mostly different versions of Baptists, right? Much less Roman Catholics, Episcopalians, etc.
Got it.
Yeah, I think of, because I live in wine country in Oregon, and I think of, if you go to a wine tasting and they talk about where you taste a particular thing. And I think the first flavor of Pentecostalism is not going to be dogmatic or doctrinal, but that's not to say that those things don't exist. It's just that's not like the leading experience or indicator of the movement.
Right. Now, this, of course, freaks out a lot of American Protestants when it emerges on the scene. And I'm not going to dwell on that, but that's part of why it is highly distinguished. And I remember even growing up in a context where I didn't know really almost anything about what was really going on, but I did hear references to the Holy Rollers, which was a phrase in part based on Pentecostal experiences of being slain in the spirit, where you fall down and you roll in a kind of spiritual ecstasy or experience of some kind. And those are the kind of pyrotechnics, I suppose you could say, that were part of the wider ethos that emerged from it. But it's about really also, is it not fair to say, it's about the experience of God as opposed to the affirmation or belief or trust in God per se. It's less about the human and more about the supernatural. Is that a fair distinction, would you say, or is that overstating it?
I think it has to do with a different framing of how you know things.
Uh-huh.
Because I think in churches like Pentecostal, churches that are, say, foregrounding the experience of the Holy Spirit, what you have is a process of coming to be a Christian that's triangled through experience, as opposed to being triangled through theological affirmations in the first place, or triangled through certain ways of being catechized or discipled or taught the faith.
Yes.
And
Right.
so, some evangelical Christians have believed that what you need to be a real Christian is to be converted by coming to a very specific understanding of your sin and then having an encounter with God and then learning that your life is sort of written into the Bible. Others would say, in almost reaction to that, well, look, actually, Christians are made at the hearth, right? Christians are made around tables or around fireplaces, etc. Pentecostals of all sorts, small p, let's be as inclusive as we can be with that, are going to say that first and foremost, Christians are made through encounter with Jesus. And an example of that in the scripture would be like the two men on the road to Emmaus, right? Who have this conversation, but more than that, they have an encounter with God that both bewilders them and galvanizes them.
Right.
And so I think what we're talking about is just a triangulation of relationship with God that begins with encounter, but doesn't exclude the other stuff.
Got it. Okay. So let's move on then to another thing that I would like us to define, which is the charismatic movement. Is that the same as Pentecostalism, different than Pentecostalism? How would that distinguish itself?
I think that charismatic has typically been a slightly more inclusive word than Pentecostal, though I'm not sure it's the same now. But when the word charismatic came into common use in the middle of the 20th century, it was really a way of describing the kinds of Holy Spirit experiences we've been talking about as they showed up in initially mainline denominations, but then also evangelical denominations. And by mainline, I don't mean to exclude Roman Catholicism either. So the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of England, or Anglican Church all over the world, Lutherans, Methodists, Episcopalians, all.
Yeah.
And so charismatic is, of course, a word that comes from Greek, and it just means essentially gifted or participating in gifts from God, right? Being given gifts. And the charismatic movement has really spread across denominations and has featured things like practices of prayer for healing, practices of listening to God, often for other people, right? Let me pray for you and see what I think God might be saying to you. Also, certain worship practices that lean towards a kind of personal one-on-one sort of intimacy. Again, rather different from some of the more architectural hymnody that talks a lot about what God is. This is more a song to God about who God is to you. And so I think the charismatic movement at one point would have understood itself in a way to include Pentecostalism, and maybe history will show us that actually Pentecostalism is what's going to include charismatics. There's enough overlapping practice and conviction that I think from our vantage point in 2025, things that used to be controversial, like what's the difference between the two, it's much more interesting to see their similarities. Wouldn't you say, Leah? What do you think?
Yeah, I've been having a lot of meta thoughts while you were talking. I agree with everything that you said. The kind of big meta thought I was having is actually related to your last thing about, what is the subsuming, if it's going to be Pentecostal or charismatic. And I was thinking, I have a student who's working on a history of the latter rain movement, which is a movement that comes out of Canadian Pentecostal circles, Canadians of European descent in the 1940s. And the thing that got me thinking about it was that these were Pentecostal people. So they come out of essentially like assemblies type backgrounds, white
Assemblies
Pentecostals.
of God.
Yeah. But their practices are just too out there for the assemblies. And also some of their ideological ideas, like some of the less savory versions of that would be like British Israelism that kind of tended to thrive in latter rain circles. So the latter rain movement precedes the charismatic movement. I would think of it as Pentecostal, but it transcends denominations. Like it exceeds, it's too much, on a lot of levels for denominational control. And the assemblies tries unsuccessfully to stymie its influence for decades. You can see it, I think, in 21st century movements like the New Apostolic Reformation are really indebted to the latter rain movement. And so I think of Pentecostals and Charismatics. This is my kind of like basic definition, because I totally agree. When I'm doing like a quick definition of charismatics, I'm like, it's Pentecostal practices outside of traditional Pentecostal denominations. That's like the fastest version of it. But when I think about the types of people who enter into Pentecostal and charismatic spaces, both of them, they are not respecters of institutions. So if you have figures like, for example, a famous one would be Oral Roberts, who is just way too big for any one denomination. He wasn't going to fit in a Pentecostal denomination. He wasn't going to fit in a Methodist context. He was just big, too big. And so I think about the people who end up in these spaces. There's all kinds of conversation today about denominational. And guess what? Charismatics and Pentecostals, they're so practical. They work with one another across all of those divides. They don't care, So whatever we call these people in this movement, I don't think they are bothered by any particular dividing line. Whatever we call it, they're like, whatever, I don't care. I'm going to work with this person over here in whatever country, in whatever context. It's way bigger, more expansive than our kind of traditional boundaries around institutions.
So, Leah, would you say that the too bigness of an Oral Roberts, using him just as an example, is too bigness of their gifts, their ego, or the experience of God that they are wanting to lift up? What is too big to fit inside the denomination?
I would say yes to all of that.
Right.
My first book was about two Pentecostal wild women, Mariah Woodworth-Etter, who was a holiness preacher who started to participate in the Pentecostal movement, became one of its architects in the late 19th and early 20th century, and Amy Semple McPherson, both of whom their egos were way too big. Their status, they were just huge figures in every sense of the word. And also, both of them reported believing in these very expansive experiences with the Holy Spirit. So I guess I would say yes to all of that. These characters, the kind of normie forms of institutional identity, the legal issues, property management, all that kind of stuff, they're just like, whatever, I think they're just too big for all of it. I don't know. What do you think, Caleb?
I certainly agree, but I'm put in mind of, that famous Buechner quote where he says, the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. I think that kind of thing is also a piece of the puzzle, because for most of these leaders, we wouldn't have heard of them if they weren't actually offering something that people were really hungry for. And that something was less about an experience that they could conjure and more about their ability to make their account of what their lives with God were like, make that accessible to lots and lots of people. So these are like paradigm people offering a paradigm for the way your Christian life could be. Now, of course, that doesn't take the celebrity parts out. It doesn't, deal with the problems of the stage and the ego and all that. But I do think there's a way in which the world's hunger was for things like this. Now, again, I just want to say very clearly, that doesn't mean it's good or it's all good, right? Those things need to be interrogated, because often the world is hungry for, McDonald's and Jolly Ranchers, or at least I am. And my doctor would like to, raise her hand. But I do think there's a way in which such folks, their bigness is actually given to them. Mm-hmm. It's not only something that they produce, it's something that the world asks of them.
I have the opportunity soon to interview Molly Worthen about her new book called Spellbound, which is really about the place from pre-revolutionary days until today of charisma in the way that it played theologically, spiritually, but also ultimately politically and economically. So we'll come back to that. But I do think that book goes into some of the details and arcs of what you're describing, both of you, so well. And I know you're acquainted with one another, and I'm glad to have a chance to talk with her. Tell me this. So we have the Pentecostal movement, we have Charismatic movement, we have the Latter-day movement. And then along comes this thing that we are now going to spend the rest of our conversation really focusing on, which is something that's become called the New Apostolic Reformation. So again, for the sake of listeners, what is that movement, and when did it emerge, and what are its most important characteristics?
Okay, so Caleb just pointed at me for those listening at home, so I'm going to start. So I think, and this is a controversial take maybe, but I think of the New Apostolic Reformation as a form of institutionalized charismatic identity that builds on grassroots consensus. So the New Apostolic Reformation, other people have documented this in much more detail than I have, but it is someone who I know, I'm sure you're familiar with, Dr. Laberton, who is doing work at Fuller Seminary, trying to understand church growth movements. So if you know anything about Pentecostalism, a big idea is not going to hit first at Fuller Seminary. So it's not going to come to what I think most people think of as a respectable evangelical institution, but it could be sort of narrativized and codified at a place like Fuller Seminary. So C. Peter Wagner is exposed to various forms of charismatic and Pentecostal Christianity, and he starts to notice some trends and some themes in what is already in transnational charismatic communities. And I say transnational because a lot of people say global Christianity, but I don't think that gets at the activity level of charismatics and Pentecostals. They're like traveling all the time and sending people to various Bible colleges. A lot of them are in the United States, but not all of them are. And Wagner is like observing this group of people, how they're doing what they're doing, and starts to notice some particular trends.
This is at a time when he's on the faculty at Fuller in this,
exactly,
what was then
yes.
called the School of World Mission. Right?
Were you there at that same time?
I was not, no. I mean, I was a student during a part of this time, but the full emergence of what becomes the church growth movement and so forth slightly predates me, and then it certainly postdates me. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was wondering because I can't imagine. I was thinking that would have been a kind of controversial set of observations.
Indeed, it was. Yes.
Okay. I'm imagining like tense faculty meetings and the like.
Yes. Let your imagination go.
Okay.
That would be right.
So when people think of the New Apostolic Reformation, they often think 1990s, C. Peter Wagner. That is a sort of intellectual, institutional origin story for it. But what I think he was getting at were some trends and themes that had been brewing for decades and was sort of, once it gets to book form or sort of dogmatic form, in the Pentecostal and Charismatic movement, that was why I was so careful to describe it as practice, is that's a much later development.
Yes, right.
So what he's observing, I've tried to argue, I wrote a book about Christian rock, which is ostensibly about Christian rock, but really it ends up being about the ascent of charismatic and Pentecostal Christianity. And 5 or 6 years before Wagner writes about these trends, a guy named Frank Peretti is writing a novel that has all these same forms of spirituality and all these same themes. So when I think of the New Apostolic Reformation, I think of it as a group of, it comes from class-wise, it comes from the more middle class, white forms of charismatic Christianity, at least in the United States. Because it's from, the charismatic movement, it's transnational from the get-go. So people are kind of trading stories and they're speaking at each other's conferences. But it's a basic combination of Pentecostalism. It includes kind of evangelical ideas about society and culture. It is essentially a network of people, but a very loose network of people. So a lot of people who, as of this taping in 2025, who've been identified by outside observers, so journalists or scholars, as quote unquote New Apostolic Reformation, will deny that, identity. So it's sort of, I think of it as, if you're going to codify Pentecostal or charismatic Christianity, it's really tricky to do because people may or may not accept that label. So it's a form of charismatic, a vision of the world. I think that probably people associate the New Apostolic Reformation most closely with a theology of public life called the Seven Mountain Mandate, which is a very charismatic rendering of a call to Christian influence in the world based on 7 particular quote unquote mountains. Pentecostals are really into things like gematria and symbolism and stuff. So there are 7 mountains in society. Pentecostals and charismatics should be exercising like God's spirit working in the world through those mandates. But that's how I think of the New Apostolic Reformation. Very loose gathering of people that come from a kind of intellectual hub that goes through C. Peter Wagner. And he was, like a lot of charismatic and Pentecostal people, pretty great at promotion. So he was out there selling this idea,
Indeed,
selling this book,
yes.
But it's really based in this kind of larger soup of ideas about how God's spirit works in the world.
Right.
And you can really see its institutional kind of class-based origins in the way that C. Peter Wagner expresses it. But those same ideas might get worked out in a different, like if it's a storefront church or a church outside the United States, those same ideas and even those same words might be employed in much different ways
yeah.
depending on who's using them.
Yes.
I don't know. What would you add to that, Caleb?
Well, I think it's worth noting that people have been using the word apostolic to talk about their leadership in sort of various forms of Christian faith since the beginning, right? But what C. Peter Wagner did was he branded it as new. And it might be worth noting that before Peter Wagner came out with his first book on the topic, which was called The New Apostolic Churches, that came out in 1998, he had a couple conferences at Fuller, at least one, which were called On the Post-Denominational Church. So that kind of captures in a phrase some of the dynamics that you're naming, Leah, right? Which is that these are Christian leaders who are very interested in the future of the church, right? I suppose post generally implies a question about what's coming next. And the thing they were trying to leave behind was what they took to be the sclerotic constraints of denominationalism. And it was being replaced by a kind of more fluid, more empowered, in a way, I think Wagner would have said, sort of more reality-based assessment of the way that it's actually individuals' gifts and charisms that move churches and church movements forward. So he would say that there was a lot of undue constraint on the work of the Spirit in the church that came from denominations. And so he wanted to get beyond that in the post-denominational church. But I think he also wanted to recognize that the thing that was happening was not just a getting free from denominational constraint, but it was also an invitation to a new way of Christian life. And he had lots to say about that. I mean, there's the apostles and the prophets piece. There's this dominionism piece that you've referred to around the 7 mountains of culture. Those things sort of gradually unfold in Wagner's thought. But I think the primary thing he wanted to name when he started by calling it the New Apostolic Reformation was, and he says this over and over again, this is the most significant thing that's happened in ecclesiology and church governance since the Reformation. Now, Wagner was an impresario. He had no lack of self-assurance in the way that he spoke.
And things.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean,
that's the most Pentecostal thing about him, right? Great
for
at
sure. Yeah, exactly. Ship it, Pete. It's a great idea. Ship it. And the idea did travel. But what's interesting when you watch the way his ideas worked is they developed over time and in certain ways became more and more like out there in terms of far afield from what normal Christian leadership and normal Christian ecclesiology would have affirmed. But on the other hand, getting that far out there for him was always pragmatic. There was always a reason. Why are you pushing these edges? Well, you're pushing these edges so that you might experience some radical new thing, which might end up being the vanguard of the church's future,
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. Now, I do think I want to just insert here that though I was not on the faculty and I was not in leadership of Fuller during this period of time, and I do have great trust and respect for the people who were there, it is one of the more baffling chapters of Fuller Seminary's history. And the fact that it continued as it did was done in part through the lens of intellectual freedom and scholarly freedom. Secondly, it was done in the name of a kind of ecumenism that Fuller was open to integrate in a context of education where you had mostly mainline denominational students, but you definitely, through international contexts and otherwise, you had a large number and a growing number of Pentecostals or Charismatics that were at Fuller. And there was this desire to not squelch the academy, but it was also or the intellectual project, but to not squelch the movement of the Spirit in a living church in which God can do what God chooses to do. So I look back on it. I would just want to say, I look back on it with a feeling that, well, God used it as God uses many things, including all three of us on this podcast call. To our surprise and amazement, God uses us despite our strengths and weaknesses. I do find it, for me, a blight on Fuller's history because it attaches us to something that I think went so far afield. It began, the School of World Mission, in fact, and certainly the church growth movement, emerged out of a sociological discovery that by Donald McGavran, that if in fact people made less sociological change, it was easier for them to come to faith. This emerges eventually in something that Peter Wagner markets as the homogeneous unit principle, that the more alike you are in a subculture, the easier it is for people in that subculture to add themselves into the movement of the body of Christ and the character of the church and so forth. And the most spectacular demonstration of that, of course, was in Korea, where you had at this very moment a revival going on that had begun in Pyongyang that ends up moving to South Korea when South Korea becomes South Korea. And during those years afterwards, it just explodes into these, of course, largely homogeneous, enormous, as in sometimes, the size of a million member congregations. And then it becomes marketed by Pete Wagner, who has all of the things you've just described and brings it to the fore and then distributes it nationally. Now, the part that I want to move to, which is the part that becomes, I'll just describe it this way in my experience, that has more fangs politically and spiritually, is the way that this movement has now progressed in all of its diversity, acknowledging that really important point that you've both made, that there's nothing really coordinated about this. It's not really as though there's a mastermind, human mastermind behind any of it. But when it moves toward dominionism, which again is one of those things I'd like one of you to define, and then in particular in its role in the current Trump administration and the place we are now in the religious right and the way that all of that intersects behind the scenes, either significantly or not significantly, based on who you talk to and who you read. So I'd like to spend our time now focusing on the implications of where this goes, both spiritually and theologically, as well as politically?
These are such good questions, Mark. I think, it's terrible when you ask a historian why has a thing happened, because they return, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and we just roll forward from there. But I think it's actually worth noticing something on the way to dominionism here, which is that, Peter Wagner, as you said, took the ideas of Donald McGavran about the thing that you were narrating, the homogeneous unit principle, and he tried to bring them to Southern California, right? And it's one thing to speak about the idea that you don't have to cross certain boundaries of class or caste or society to invite someone to church in Korea or even in India, where McGavran was a missionary, right? Literally trying to cross caste divides is probably not necessarily the first step in building a church. Although, of course, when you read, say, the pastoral epistles, there's a whole lot about crossing class divides. But Wagner's move to take those missiological ideas and try to indigenize them, if you like, into U.S. context, produced all kinds of things. I mean, the most pernicious things worth paying attention to would be, does that basically just give a soft pass to racism and classism?
Quite, yes.
But even if we bracket that as something that he obviously didn't intend, even if he did permit some of that stuff, the thing that he focused on with absolute laser-like focus was something that we could call cultural relevance, right? His idea was that the way churches should be done was, number one, charismatic, i.e. the churches that are growing around the world are doing these charismatic things. They're praying for the sick, they're worshiping in a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. But number two, it doesn't require you to move outside of your current social location. So for instance, if you don't wear a tie and a jacket to go to work, why should you have to do it to go to church, right? If you don't listen to the kinds of songs that they play in churches, why not? Then there were a number of pastors and leaders who were developing ideas around this, people like Robert Schuller, of course. I should mention the name John Wimber here. Wimber and Wagner were friends, and Wimber was sort of the founding leader of the Vineyard movement, which is, before Wimber's time, the place where Bob Dylan had come to faith. There was a number of kind of really eye-opening moments for Christians where there was an overlap between the possibility of Christianity and a kind of cultural, real interestingness.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
When Bob Dylan's in your church, suddenly your church is relevant whether you like it or not.
Yes.
And then he goes around singing Christian songs for 3-4 years, and you feel like you might be on the edge of the apocalypse, as Bob Dylan himself certainly did. So to the point, cultural relevance becomes very important to the way that Wagner, as he's developing the ideas of the post-denominational church or the New Apostolic Reformation, that idea is at the center. And he would explain that, I think, as a kind of reality-based assessment of what's going on. He took himself to be a sociologist, which is fair enough. So he's basically saying, when we look at how things actually work in the world, the traditional church often works at cross purposes to how things work. We should adjust the way in which we operate to be more relevant to culture and also more savvy in the way that culture is. So to the question about dominionism is really just 2 or 3 logical steps from an obsession with cultural relevance, right? Cultural relevance says church should fit, not prophetically, but should fit all but seamlessly into modes of culture that people are already in, right? And we've all seen things like this. And it's not all bad. This is Willow Creek. This is Saddleback. There are a whole variety of churches emerging in the 80s and 90s that were just trying to do that. Hey, guys, we're Christians. We're not weird. And you can be our friends. You might even enjoy it. Plus, we have a great youth group, that kind of thing. And in come the people looking for the pizza and the nice songs. And they got them. Dominionism says, we're not just culturally relevant in church, but in fact, we believe that culture is organized around a very specific set of kind of power centers, right? And those are in the seven mountain mandate, which is almost synonymous with dominionism in this moment. Those are, I looked it up, family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government.
Right.
So those are the seven mountains of culture, which a dominionist would say, well, look, if the church is meant to be relevant to the world, we should also in turn believe that Christians are meant to be the head and not the tail of those things. Christians, the world would go better if Christians were in charge of each of those arenas.
Which is both about power as well as about the authority of a Christian understanding the way, quote, reality is really meant to be ordered.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I have such a basic interpretation of dominionism as an American religious historian. I'll run this by you, Caleb, too. But at no point in time in the history of these United States and the history of European settlers in the New World have Protestants not been interested in having a great deal of influence over public life, right?
Sure.
No community of Protestants have not been deeply invested,
right,
from the magistrates on,
sure,
in shaping American public life in profound ways. So I think one interpretation of dominionist theology and the rise of the New Apostolic Reformation is that this coincides with the rise of charismatic and Pentecostal Christianity writ large. So it's on the rise in the right. And I prefer, actually, instead of Christian nationalism, I prefer the term religious right, because I think it's a little bit more accurate in terms of like what you can expect on the right, because it's not just Christians over there. But the fact that the New Apostolic Reformation is ascendant and that there are all these think pieces about them, the think pieces sound a lot to me like how people were writing about the Christian Coalition in the 1990s, about how they were writing about the moral majority in the 1980s. It's a Pentecostal and charismatic flavor on a very familiar trope,
right,
which is that there are conservative folks in predominantly, but I think what's key in the charismatic circles, not exclusively white conservatives who would like to exercise power and authority in the public sphere. They want to legislate it. They want to have close relationships with the president. And so there's a sort of exoticized imagination around a lot of this stuff. But a simple explanation from my perspective is there are Pentecostals and charismatics everywhere, in every form of Christianity in the United States, particularly in non-denominational churches. The form of Christian worship in most of those spaces is formally Pentecostal or charismatic. I think the best example of that, and I put it in my book about Christian music, was I used to talk about Elevation Church, which is one of the hot, worship generating congregations, as Southern Baptist in name only, because it was technically a Southern Baptist church. But right before my book published, they disaffiliated. So now they're non-denominational charismatic. So they're everywhere is what I'm saying. So we should expect them on the far right because we should expect them everywhere, which is a less sensational interpretation of the movement. So we would expect the way that Presbyterians did in the time of J. Edgar Hoover, for example, the way Presbyterians exercised authority in the public sphere and sought to instantiate, especially conservative white Presbyterians, sought to, instantiate Christian dominion in the 20th century. We're just seeing Pentecostalized versions of that now. So it's very glam. It's very celebrity oriented. You can see why Donald Trump and these folks get along so well. There are so many cultural, forms of overlap, but we should also expect to see charismatic and Pentecostalization of other forms of American Christianity. So it's a less kind of interesting rendition of it, but that's what I see when there are, in these times that we live in, media is so oriented toward clicks and profit. And so sensationalized renditions abound. But I'm like, well, isn't this just conservative political activism with tongues and prophecy and dominion? And I would also say that charismatics and Pentecostals unlike other forms of American Protestantism, like Baptists, for example, do not have a theological value for democracy the way that other forms do. They have a different orientation toward the world. So yet they're not as interested in a like kind of Cold War democratic world order because that has never been foundational to who they are, unlike, for example, the Baptists. So I'm sort of basic about my interpretation of them. I'm like, yeah, of course they're going to be out there. Figures like Lance Wallnau. I mean, he is Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson, but in another, a more Pentecostalized version of him.
And the convergence, which I think you're pointing to, is that's so critical, is that the current administration is also anti-institutional and anti-structure in general, anti-predictability. And all of that in a cultural vibe, of course, is convergent with Pentecostalism, which is all of those things typically. And this is, I do think, a somewhat different thing than the comparison to earlier 20th century models, is that the very nature of the way that the president seeks power and ego affirmation also aligns with the quest for power, albeit on the part of the best intentions of some of the people involved in the New Apostolic Reformation, is seeking power as well, or claiming power, apostolic authority, supra-biblical apostolic authority that is above and beyond the biblical witness itself. So it's unboundaried. And the convergence of egos, the convergence of ethos, the convergence of a political moment that is in the New Apostolic Reformation pressing on toward the fulfillment of this seven mountain vision of Christian theocratic rule is a natural thing to see emerging. But what I think you've both done a great job in helping us understand is that Pentecostalism and charismatic movements are not themselves theocratic. And I think what it seems to me is distinct, and correct me if I'm still not really understanding this, is that the New Apostolic Reformation really is theocratic in its core, that it really does believe not just that Jesus is Lord, but that lordship is meant to be transmuted or delivered in and through the uniqueness of the United States of America for the blessings and ultimately control, I guess is the word that comes to my mind, of all things. Mm-hmm. And for me, as a fierce believer in both the legitimacy of order, institutions, and dependency on the Holy Spirit to do whatever God chooses to do, all of that can be easily inflamed, and I admit it can be easily inflamed in my own imagination, but clearly not just mine. I mean, it was interesting that just recently The Atlantic published an article that hyperinflated the numeric participation of people in this movement, which is, I think you're saying, less a movement and more like a bunch of people who are having experiences in loose and open networks that share a certain kind of orientation that has found itself in the public sphere in a different way, but it's not really like a galvanizing movement that's seeking domination. But I think there are people in it that are. So those are some of my own concerns.
Yeah. I mean, I think I really like Leah's sort of attempt to show like the banality of dominionism in the sense that it's true. Christians have been seeking power and influence from, the very beginning of certainly the United States, but it may simply be part of what it is to be a Christian, is to say, at some level within the spheres that I'm given authority in, I ought to have the right kind of influence, whatever it is, right? So that's a very general thing to say, but I think it's true. There's a kind of stewardship to that, which is, I believe that I'm onto something here, and I'd like to share it in ways that are helpful. That can go more or less well or badly, be more or less beneficial or pernicious. But I think, Mark, the thing that you named about believing as you do that there's such a thing as good order and being led by the Spirit at the same, and dependent on the Spirit. Not only is that Christian, But that might be what I was trying to describe earlier as small c charismatic, right? That might be a way in which a charismatic impulse moves through the church, but never quite finds itself into the kind of anti-structural, anti-institutional instincts that are more typically associated with Pentecostalism. Now, again, these are fluid terms. I'm sure there's a bunch of Pentecostals who love order as well. So, I'm not trying to make blanket pronouncements as much as just pay attention to the places that this desire for power and influence moves. Because I think what's scary about the moment that we're in right now is, in fact, the chaos. And a number of people associated with the NAR have actually celebrated the chaos of this moment. I think of Lance Wallnau, who's also, tied up in the Seven Mountains Mandate idea. He wrote a book about Donald Trump called God's Chaos Candidate. And what he was saying was that his own prophetic intuitions were leading him to pay attention to the fact that God was introducing Trump as an agent of chaos in a world that had become so ordered that it was choking out the movement of the Spirit sort of by institutional pressure, I guess, right? And Trump was going to break that. It strikes me that a lot of what lies at the heart of that sort of familiar species that folks point to and say, I think that's NAR, is a preference for chaos over order, and a preference for, if we break it, God will make something better in its place, right? Now, that's a kind of eschatology, right? That's a way of thinking about sort of history and theology together. And, as Leah said, there are Christian nationalisms on the left and on the right.
Sure.
Joel Looper has this wonderful book called Another Gospel, where he shows the way that Christians on the left and the right in American history have very much been Christian nationalist in a deliberate sense, right? Whether that be the Bible Society folks or Walter Rauschenbusch or, even into the civil rights movement. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that stuff shows up.
Yes.
And they've all had eschatology to go with it, by the way. But the thing that I think we're zeroing in on here is a particular kind of theocracy.
Yes.
I mean, again, it's Christian affirmation that one day God will rule everything. Right. So to the degree that that's theocratic, I think all Christians are included in a theocratic frame. But what the NAR people are doing is saying, we are going to advocate for the destruction of contemporary order through both spiritual warfare, praying and worshiping and blowing shofars and stuff, and through often totally quixotic political candidacies, like the candidacy of Sean Foyt, or as it turns out, the candidacy of, is it Carrie Lake from Arizona? A number of people whose...
Lauren Boebert.
Lauren Boebert, not so quixotic. Here I am in Colorado.
That's right.
She's one of my representatives.
She's your lady.
She's one of my, but many of the others have just totally failed. Doug Mastriani in Pennsylvania. But then there's Trump, right? So Trump gets written into this story of chaos and sort of new spiritual order. Leah, I can see you have many things to say. Let me just stop talking.
Oh, no. I was thinking with you. So I was thinking about that Atlantic article. And I think if there's a logical move that the article makes that I don't follow, it would be equating the New Apostolic Reformation with the rise of Pentecostalism. And I'll just give you one example why I don't think that that is a move that I can make. So a lot of the practices associated with Pentecostalism, for example, the belief in divine prophecy, are so widespread, but they transcend partisanship. So I did some polling. I was a public fellow with PRRI, and they let us, I couldn't believe they actually let us, I felt like a kid in a candy store, start to survey for Pentecostal and charismatic practices, which should have been done many years ago. But, there's a lot of traditionalists in the polling world. So we started to actually look into who are these people, like who adopts these practices. And what we found is that it transcends party. It transcends partisanship. So the idea that a lot of Americans believe in prophecy is not an indication that the new Apostolic Reformation is super widespread. So that's the logical move in a lot of coverage of the NAR that I do not agree with, is that actually, and so the community that I think is the best indicator of that is the Black Pentecostal and Charismatic community. So Black Pentecostals and Charismatics are, perhaps not surprisingly, pretty immune to the charms of Donald Trump and the kind of far right forms of republicanism that we now see on the so-called Christian right. So, but they're deeply Pentecostal. They believe in prophecy. Like Caleb said, they believe in apocalypticism. They have all these interpretations. So that's one move that I think that the coverage of the NAR makes that I just cannot follow because the data doesn't back it up. But the other thing that I think is important, kind of one of the takeaways that I have from, just coverage of Charismatics and Pentecostals, is the way that Charismatics and Pentecostals on the right conceive of the nation. So I don't think you actually find a lot of Charismatics on the far right that think about the nation in terms of American exceptionalism. So they actually don't think that the United States is the nation of all nations. They do have one nation, though, in mind. They think the nation of Israel is the nation of all nations. That, I think, is something that people should pay more attention to because it is a portable form of nationalism.
Yes.
So you can be super nationalistic in Guatemala, in Brazil, in India, and in the United States. And in fact, I wrote a little thing about Sean Foyt, the worship activist, he's an equal opportunity nationalist. He made this little video of himself it was around the 4th of July. So he had American flag, everything. I think he even had American flag clogs, and but he was selling to his followers denim jackets with the Indian flag on it. And was promoting, India for Indians. So there's a form of nationalism that is subservient to the nation of Israel that's different than American exceptionalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the thing that people kind of have a hard time getting their heads around. These folks, like the far right NAR folks, when people are telling them American democracy is at stake, they don't actually care long-term about American democracy. You might be able to make that appeal to a Billy Graham era evangelical and they'd stop for a second. But I think what people need to understand about this crew, and I'm not saying it represents all Charismatics or Pentecostals by any means, but those kind of far-right activists, is they are not moved by appeals to American democracy or American exceptionalism because they have in their mind the end times and the nation of Israel, who Trump understands deals, right? Like that's his whole thing. And he, or someone in his administration, he doesn't seem like a particularly devout man, but someone in his administration has clued him into the fact that if you will give like some sort of lip service to Zionism, you're going to have those charismatics at your back forever. And that is exactly what he's done. And that is exactly what he's achieved. And it's just a different conversation. Sometimes when I look at coverage, I'm like, it's like these two conversations that are people are talking across each other without actually listening to what these people are saying. They're being very sensationalist and they're glitzy. They're kind of gaudy.
Yes.
They're opportunistic, they're transactional, which, by the way, if you know anything about prosperity theology, is not a huge problem for, it's not like a theological crisis to be transactional with God or anybody else. And so, but they're not actually listening to what they say. And if you listen to what they say, it actually makes a certain kind of sense. I'm certainly not saying I agree with it, but there is a
internal
conception.
Logic.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not illogical in its own way.
I'm struck by the long story of the church throughout all of the generations and how an earlier form of dominionism would have easily been able to be used to describe, for example, the Roman Catholic doctrine of discovery, that wherever you move in the world, if you discover pagans there, then you can more or less just plant the flag and claim it for Christ. And colonialism follows from that, and many of the implications of that kind of use of power are still with us vividly around the world as the impact of that continues on. So I guess as I come to the end of our conversation, one of the things that I think has been very helpful, and I knew it would be, I hope it will be for our listeners, is really this long historical arc of what it is that's actually been happening. I think the sorting out of power is one of the great questions of what the gospel of Jesus Christ is actually meant to do, and the fact that no one and nothing else is deserving of being called Lord except Jesus. And that is an ultimate and eschatological claim, as well as a claim today. How it intersects with other forms of power in our world of all different types and shapes, political and economic and social and whatever else it might be. That is an ongoing struggle in the life of the church. And the history of the church is a history of how we have tried to figure that out, live that out, describe that, claim it, lay it down. I mean, all the varying implications. And I feel like you've given us all an enormous amount to think about and more to chase. We will include in the notes some of your recommendations of books or resources that you think would be helpful for people to follow up on. And I just want to say how grateful I am for both of you. And this combination that to me is a combination of both a deep trust in the living reality of God, who is free and active in the world and doing what God chooses to do, who uses the church as a very ordinary instrument with all of its complexities and contradictions, and holds the long and final story. So just want to say thank you for using your gifts as significantly as you both do, and for this rich conversation.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. What a joy.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Laberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Laberton. Thanks for listening with me.